In Chapter 3, we're going to talk about how much delinquency exists and is it rising. So the first thing we're going to look at is arrest data. In 2016, police agencies in the U.S. made an estimated 856,130 arrests of people under the age of 18. This is a 58% drop from 2007. So we have some charts in here that I just want you to kind of take a minute to look at. You can see the number of juvenile arrests. We see 2007 to 2016, 2012 to 2016, and 2015 to 2016. So this just kind of gives you an idea. You can see that for the property crime index, we have a much higher rate. Now, the reason we have an NA next to rape is because the definition of rape changed in 2016, I believe. So it means that we can't compare that data from one year to another. In the past, the definition of rape was only of a female and only with force. So those numbers weren't really very accurately representing what, first of all, the law considers to be rape and what is actually rape. So if you notice, you're going to see, of course, property crime is much more prevalent than violent crime. Here we have a breakdown of next of other offenses. Notice in here we do have things like liquor law violations, driving under the influence, curfew and loitering. And again, runaways is no longer in here because the UCR is no longer tracking those. Here we have a breakdown by race. So if you look at the first set of columns, we've got the total number of offenses, those committed by white youth, minority youth, black youth, American Indian, Asian. And then we have it for the rest of these offenses here as well. We also have some data about how many kids are residing in juvenile detention, correctional, and our residential facilities. You can see that this number has decreased from 2007, and the rate now is 152 per 100,000. Here we have the same data, again broken down by race. So you can see here that black youth are disproportionately represented compared to white youth. Self-report data. The Monitoring the Future survey, as I mentioned before, is given to about 2,500 high school seniors. We've talked a little bit already about some of the problems with it, and that what it mostly is looking at is status offenses. The data they publish, however, mostly has to do with drug offenses, and you can see some snapshots here from the 2017 Monitoring the Future. So daily marijuana use is steady. Marijuana use throughout the country has been steady since the 70s. So 71% of high school seniors do not view regular marijuana smoking as being very harmful. We also see binge drinking has appeared to level off. And then we can also see some data here about misuse of prescription and over-the-counter drugs versus illicit drugs. The National Youth Survey was administered to 1,700 teens between the ages of 11 and 17. They asked the same group of students in 1976, and then they asked them several other times up through the 1990s. And they asked them about status behavior, minor crimes, and serious crimes. And they also measured exactly how many times each act was committed. In 2006, this is the most recent year I can find data for, there were 5,200 self-reported acts of delinquency per 100 juveniles, with 34 million juveniles engaged in hundreds of millions of delinquent acts. But keep in mind that status offenses and minor crimes are the most common. Victimization data. This is data from the NCVS in 2016 for kids between 12 and 17. There were 469,490 violent victimizations that year. That's a rate of 30.9 per thousand persons, with about 27% reported to the police. For serious violent victimizations, it was 8.6, with nearly half of those reported to the police. Again, property and minor crimes are more common than violent and serious crimes. Those most likely to be victimized by violent crime are young people, males, except for rape and sexual assault, African Americans, and people who are of lower income. We rarely rarely see offenders in our property crimes, so we don't get a lot of good age information here. But in 2015, about 14% of all serious violent crimes reportedly involved a juvenile offender. And in nearly half of those, more than one offender was involved. So juveniles tend to get in trouble with their friends. So arrest data provide the lowest estimates, and self-report gives us the highest. Self-report is probably the most accurate estimate. All data sources tell us, though, that minor crimes are more common than serious crimes, and property crimes more common than violent crimes. We can look at this with some trends, and this gets a little hard to follow, so we're going to talk about it, but I don't want you to get too hung up on the exact details. But property crime is fairly stable from the early 80s to 94, and then it was in a decline. So the late 80s to early 90s, we see a big spike in crime. This is due to a variety of issues, gangs, crack cocaine, and then the economy as well. So the rate of Part 1 violent crime is pretty stable from 1980 to 1988. There's a big increase, as I said, late 80s, early 90s, and then a decrease. The rate of murder more than doubled between 1987 and 1993, and this is really the result of gun-related murders and issues related to gangs. Self-reported delinquency from Monitoring the Future shows that it's relatively stable in the early to mid-80s, a modest increase during the 80s and 90s, and a small decline during the 2000s. Where this differs from arrest data is how sharp of a decline there is. So it follows the same trend, it's just how sharp of an increase and how sharp of a decline there is differs. The rate of violent crime follows a similar pattern, stable during much of the 80s, an increase during the late 80s and 90s, and then a slight decrease. Now again, arrest data shows a larger increase in the late 80s and a larger decline in the mid-90s. Percentage of high school seniors who used illicit drugs in the last 30 days, so those are illegal drugs, has a large increase from the early 80s to 1992, increases during the 90s, but decreases since the early 2000s. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health reports on drug use, and the rate of drug use has declined during the 80s and early 90s, increased during the early to mid-90s, and generally stable since then. Of course, our big drug use issue today is opiates. Victimization data, we just talked about this a little bit from the NCVS, talks about juveniles aged 12 to 17. So this is moderately stable during the 80s, increases during the 80s to 90s, and declines. So it's very similar to the arrest trends. To sum this up, property crime, arrest and self-report data disagree, but they disagree on how sharp of a decline there is. So there's been a decline in serious property crime since the mid-90s, but no decline in minor property crime. As far as violent crime goes, arrest and victimization data indicate the rate is stable in the early to mid-80s, increases in the late 80s, early 90s, and then there's a substantial decrease from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. Self-report data show a more moderate increase and therefore a more moderate decrease. Drug crimes, their overall rates declined substantially during the 80s and early 90s, increased from 92 to the early 2000s, and has decreased since. So what are some reasons for this dramatic decline since the mid-90s? So as I mentioned, there was problems regarding crack cocaine use, and there was a decline in turf disputes. The economy got better in the 90s. We have begun studying police practices and improving them during that same time period. We increased the use of prevention and rehabilitation programs and incarcerated juvenile offenders at higher rates. Whether or not that decline continues really depends on trends in the economy and how we make use of effective crime control strategies. So numbers can be overwhelming, and as you saw, there's a lot of detail there. But think of it this way. If someone were to ask you how much delinquency is there in the United States, what would you say? What types of delinquent acts do juveniles tend to commit? Is delinquency increasing in the U.S.? So think about how you could talk about it in more general terms.